There is something happening in American politics right now that almost nobody wants to talk about. Not on cable news, not in the halls of Congress, not even in the strategy meetings where it matters most. And that silence, that deliberate, calculated silence, is telling us something. You see, there's a difference between a politician choosing not to discuss something and a politician being unable to discuss something. One is strategy, the other is a trap. For months now, Republicans have occupied the highest echelons of power. They control the Senate. They control the House. And yet, when you listen to their public statements, when you watch their press conferences and their town halls, you notice something peculiar. There is a conversation missing, a conversation they know they need to have, a conversation they know will define the next chapter of their party, but one they seem almost afraid to begin. It's not that the issue lacks urgency, quite the opposite. Every metric suggests it's becoming more pressing by the day. Economic indicators are red. Public sentiment is shifting in real time. Within their own coalition, the pressure is building, quietly at first, then with unmistakable intensity. But Republican leadership remains silent. Now you might ask, why would a party in power deliberately avoid addressing something so consequential? The answer is not simple. It requires understanding the particular constraints they face. Constraints that don't fit neatly into partisan talking points or cable news segments. It requires understanding that sometimes the most important political stories are the ones nobody is telling. This is one of those stories. Over the next few minutes, we're going to examine what the GOP isn't talking about. We're going to understand why they aren't talking about it. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to consider what their silence reveals about where American politics is actually heading. Not where the headlines suggest it's heading, but where the underlying currents are actually taking us. Because in politics, what you choose not to say is often far more revealing than what you do. To understand why this moment is so fraught, we need to step back. We need to understand the choices that led here. For nearly 2 decades, the Republican Party built its coalition on a particular foundation, a foundation of certain economic assumptions, certain foreign policy commitments, certain cultural priorities. These weren't arbitrary choices, they were deliberate. They were intentional, and for a long time they worked. But here's what happens in politics. The ground shifts. Slowly. Then all at once. The financial crisis of 2008 shook faith in the economic orthodoxy that had defined Republican thinking since the Reagan era. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan ground on, creating a growing skepticism about military interventionism within the conservative base. And demographic changes, the kind that unfold over decades but become undeniable in a single election cycle, began to reshape what the electorate actually looked like. By 2016, something had broken loose within the Republican Party, not a fracture that showed up on cable news every night, but a deeper rupture. A growing section of the GOP base had begun asking questions that their leadership had never really prepared an answer for. Questions about trade, questions about the pace of immigration, questions about whether the old consensus still held. And then came the 2020 election, and everything that followed. What we're dealing with now is the aftermath of that earthquake. The party won back the White House. They consolidated congressional power, but the ideological coherence that had once held them together had been replaced by something far more fragmented and precarious. Inside the GOP, there are now factions with fundamentally different visions of what the party should be, and the leadership, the people with actual power, finds itself in an impossible position. Move too sharply in one direction and you alienate a crucial wing of your coalition. Move too slowly and you risk being swept aside by forces you can no longer control. This is the architecture of their current silence. This is why the conversation they should be having remains unspoken. Because once you start that conversation, you have to finish it. And finishing it means admitting something the party has spent years trying to avoid. That the old consensus is gone and nobody quite agrees on what should replace it. So what is it exactly that they're not talking about? It centers on a fundamental question of governance. How does a party that has made certain commitments to its base actually govern when the economic and political realities make those commitments increasingly difficult to honor? Let me be specific. Reports indicate that within Republican circles there is growing recognition of a structural problem. The tax and spending policies that have long formed the core of GOP economic doctrine are increasingly at odds with the fiscal realities they actually inherited. The deficits are larger than anticipated. The revenue projections are more complicated than the simple models suggested, and the political cost of actually delivering on the party's economic promises in a way that's mathematically coherent is far steeper than anyone publicly acknowledges. But here's where it gets more complex. It's not just an economics problem, it's a legitimacy problem. The party made promises to its base about certain priorities, about where money would be spent, about what would be cut, what would be protected, what would be expanded. And many of those promises are in direct tension with each other. You cannot simultaneously cut taxes drastically, maintain defense spending at current levels, protect Social Security and Medicare, and balance the budget. The math simply doesn't work. Now, every party faces difficult fiscal choices. That's not unique to Republicans. But what is unique is the degree to which their coalition depends on believing that these trade-offs don't actually exist, that there's some combination of efficiency savings and economic growth that will make everything work out, that you don't have to choose. Sources close to Republican leadership suggest that conversations behind closed doors have become increasingly tense on this subject. There is recognition that some accounting must be reckoned with, but there is also deep fear about what happens when that reckoning becomes public. Because once you start being honest about fiscal constraints, once you start admitting that certain promises cannot be kept in their current form, you've opened a door that's very difficult to close. You've invited your coalition to ask harder questions, questions about what you actually stand for, questions about whether you're really committed to the principles you've always claimed to champion. And that conversation, they're simply not ready to have. Why choose silence? Why not just address this head on? The answer lies in understanding the particular political moment Republicans find themselves in. And it's more intricate than simple cowardice or incompetence. First, understand the coalition they represent. It is not monolithic. Within the Republican Party, you have fiscal conservatives who care deeply about budget deficits. You have social conservatives for whom certain spending priorities are sacred. You have nationalist conservatives who prioritize American industrial capacity and trade policy. You have traditional foreign policy hawks, and you have a significant segment that has lost faith in institutions altogether. These groups often want incompatible things. The fiscal conservative wants spending cuts, the defense hawk wants military expansion, the nationalist wants industrial subsidies, the social conservative wants tax advantage investments in religious institutions. All of these desires cannot be simultaneously satisfied within the same budget constraint. For years, the strategy has been to avoid choosing to speak in the language of growth and efficiency and suggest that the tension between these priorities is illusory. But as the deficits mount and the hard realities become undeniable, that strategy is fraying. Republican leadership faces a genuine dilemma. If they move too boldly toward fiscal austerity, they risk losing working-class support that has become crucial to their electoral coalition. If they maintain current spending levels and defense commitments, they undermine the fiscal conservative wing. And if they try to have an honest conversation about trade-offs, they risk the entire coalition fragmenting into competing interest groups that no longer trust each other. The calculation, therefore, is to delay, to maintain the illusion of coherence for as long as possible, to avoid the conversation that might force a reckoning. But here's what strategists know. Delays don't make problems disappear. They make them larger. The longer you avoid a necessary conversation, the more urgently it demands to be had. And when it finally occurs, when circumstances force it into the open, the stakes are invariably higher, the positions more entrenched, and the possibility of finding common ground more remote. This is the gamble Republican leadership is making. They're betting that they can govern without fully reckoning with internal contradictions. History suggests that's a dangerous bet. You might reasonably ask, if Republicans have successfully avoided this conversation for this long, why should it matter now? The answer is that the objective conditions have shifted. And when objective conditions change, political choices that were previously sustainable become increasingly untenable. Consider what analysts are observing. The economy is showing signs of stress that cannot be indefinitely masked by positive headlines. Growth is moderating. Inflation, while improved from its recent peak, remains elevated in sectors that affect working families most directly: housing, food, energy. And the national debt continues to grow at a pace that even some traditionally hawkish economists now describe as unsustainable. These are not partisan observations. These are basic facts about the trajectory we're on. Simultaneously, political pressure is mounting from multiple directions. Within the Republican base, there is growing skepticism about whether their leaders are actually fighting for them. Where is the dramatic action? Where are the institutional changes? Why do the same problems persist even when the party holds power? This skepticism is dangerous for leadership because it opens space for challenger, for voices that promise to cut through the complications and deliver something real. And once that space is open, once people begin to doubt whether the existing leadership is truly committed, institutional control becomes fragile. Internationally, the situation compounds the pressure. America's geopolitical challenges are not simplifying. If anything, they're becoming more complex and costly. And a Republican Party that lacks internal coherence about what it actually believes finds itself less capable of responding decisively to external threats. Finally, there is a basic question of democratic legitimacy. The Republican Party was elected on certain premises. If those premises cannot be delivered, if the promises made to the base cannot be honestly fulfilled, then there is a democratic obligation to say so, to explain what can actually be done, to have a conversation about what the party truly stands for. The window for avoiding this conversation is closing. Not because someone has decided it should close, but because reality has a way of forcing clarity. The longer leadership delays, the more chaotic the eventual reckoning becomes. The question isn't whether this conversation will happen. The question is whether it will happen on terms that the party can manage, or whether it will happen in ways that leave everything in ruins. So where does this lead? There are a few trajectories worth considering, and none of them are particularly comfortable for Republican leadership. One possibility is that the party maintains its current course. It continues to avoid the hard conversation. It continues to govern without fully reconciling its internal contradictions. In this scenario, the contradictions don't disappear. They fester. Pressure builds within the coalition. Trust erodes. And eventually something breaks. Maybe it's an electoral defeat. Maybe it's the rise of a faction that refuses the existing consensus. Maybe it's simply the accumulation of broken promises that eventually discredits the entire enterprise. Another possibility is that leadership musters the courage to have the conversation that's needed to lay out the real constraints, to explain what can actually be done and what cannot, to ask the coalition to make genuine choices about priorities. This path is painful. It risks internal conflict, but it also offers the possibility of rebuilding on a foundation of honesty rather than illusion. There is a third path, the one that seems increasingly likely, a kind of half conversation, where some parts of the difficult truth get discussed but in fragmented, contradictory ways, where different leaders say different things to different audiences, where the party tries to have it both ways without the intellectual coherence to pull it off. In this scenario, Republicans govern. They may even accumulate policy wins in certain areas, but the underlying coherence continues to erode. The coalition becomes more fractious, and the party finds itself increasingly unable to respond effectively to challenges that demand unified action and clear thinking. The stakes are high here, not just for Republicans, but for American governance more broadly. When one of the two major parties lacks internal clarity about what it believes and what it's willing to do, it affects the entire system's ability to respond to genuine crises. This is what makes the GOP's silence so significant. It's not a minor rhetorical choice. It's a sign of something deeper. A party grappling with contradictions it hasn't yet found a way to resolve. The conversation will come. It always does. The only question is what shape it takes when it arrives.